With the Beagle's departure from King George's Sound, the main subject matter of this series of presentations has come to a close. However, Darwin's involvement with Australia did not end when he left its shores. Indeed, several interesting links between Darwin and Australia were either maintained or established in later years. The aim of this presentation is to summarise these connections by giving accounts of the subsequent lives of various people who played important roles in the story that has unfolded in the previous presentations. We start with Sims Covington. Covington stayed as an assistant in clerk with Darwin after the voyage until May 1839, a few months after Darwin was married. Having presumably liked what he saw during the Beagle's visit to Australia, Covington decided to emigrate to the colony. Not surprisingly, Darwin wrote letters of reference for Covington to people that he, Darwin, knew in Australia. Covington was quite successful in Australia, marrying a local lass and ending up in Pambilla on the south coast of New South Wales, where, in the words of the local history museum, and I quote, he took up land, establishing businesses including the Forest Oak Inn and a general store, and occupied important public positions as postmaster, on the bench of magistrates and the Pambilla National School Board, unquote. In 2023, the New South Wales government announced that it will be erecting a blue plaque in Pambilla to honour Sims Covington. This photograph shows Covington's Forest Oak Inn and General Store Post Office that is now a Thai restaurant, Covington's Thai Cuisine. Darwin and Covington corresponded from 1843 until Covington's death in 1861. Unfortunately, all of Covington's letters to Darwin and all but one of Darwin's letters to Covington have been lost. However, on the 9th of August 1884, transcriptions of 10 of Darwin's letters to Covington were published in the Sydney Mail newspaper. In addition to telling us a great deal about the relationship between Covington and Darwin, these letters provide a series of personal snapshots of Darwin during the years in which he was formulating and publishing his revolutionary ideas. We do not have time to go through all these letters in this presentation. We will present just a few highlights. In 1849, Darwin writes, I am now employed on a large volume describing the anatomy and all the species of barnacles from all over the world. I do not know whether you live by the sea, but if so, I should be very glad if you would collect me any that adhere, small and large, to the coast rocks or to shells or to corals thrown up by gales, and send them to me without cleaning out the animals and taking care of the bases. You will remember that barnacles are conical little shells with a sort of four-valved lid on the top. There are others with a long, flexible foot stalk fixed to floating objects and sometimes cast on shore. I should be very glad of any specimen, but do not give yourself much trouble about them. If you do send me any, they had better be directed to the Geological Society, Somerset House, and a letter sent to inform me of them. Covington obliged and sent a box of barnacles from the south coast of New South Wales. Darwin responds, I thank you very sincerely for the great trouble which you must have taken in collecting so many specimens. One of the kinds is most curious. It is a new species of a genus of which only one specimen is known to exist in the world, and it's in the British Museum. When Darwin published his 4-volume monograph on barnacles in 1851 and 1854, he described 31 Australian species, including the ones collected by Covington. In that same letter, Darwin adds a personal touch. I assure you, though I am a rich man, when I think of the future, I very often ardently wish I was settled in one of our colonies. For I have now 4 sons, 7 children in all, and more coming, and what on earth to bring them up to do, I do not know. Here's Darwin's description of one of the barnacles collected by Covington at Twofold Bay, just south of Pambula. And here's plate 20 in that same barnacle monograph, showing 5 views of the species described in the previous slide. 53. Darwin writes, I feel a great interest about Australia and read every book I can get hold of. 2 years later, Darwin reminisces about the beagle's arrival in Sydney back in 1836. How little you thought when we landed together at Sydney that you should one day have land and house letting £83 per annum. A year later, Darwin writes, You did a wise thing when you became a colonist. What a much better prospect you have for your sons, bringing them up as farmers, the happiest and most independent career a man can almost have, compared to what they could have been in this old burthened country, with every soul struggling for subsistence. Then, in May 1858, just a few weeks before the famed letter arrived from Alfred Wallace, Darwin tells Covington about his big book on the origin of species, which, after receiving Wallace's letter, was condensed into the book that was actually published in 1859. I have for some years been preparing a work for publication, which I commenced 20 years ago, and for which I sometimes find extracts in your handwriting. This work will be my biggest. It treats on the origin of varieties of our domestic animals and plants, and on the origin of species in a state of nature. I have to discuss every branch of natural history, and the work is beyond my strength and tries me sorely. Unfortunately, we cannot follow the aftermath of the publication of Origin of Species in this series of letters, because Covington died of paralysis on the 19th of February 1861. Only 47 years old, he was buried in the Pambula Cemetery, where the headstone records that he was Darwin's assistant on the Beagle. We now turn to Conrad Martens. Martens remained in Sydney for the rest of his life. After marrying, he moved with his family to the northern side of Sydney Harbour, where he built Rockley Grange, shown here in a Martens sketch. Part of the remains of this house is incorporated in the present buildings of the MacKillop campus of the Australian Catholic University. Martens had helped the architect James Hume to design the Church of St Thomas, shown here in a Martens painting. The church was built between 1843 and 1845 in present-day Church Street, North Sydney, half a kilometre from Martens' house. The first rector of St Thomas was the Reverend W. B. Clarke, a pioneering geologist, sometimes called the father of Australian geology. At the church's first vestry meeting, Martens was appointed the rector's warden. Between 1881 and 1884, the original church was replaced by a larger one that still exists today. The sandstone font that Martens carved in 1845 and the communion vessels that he donated for the original church are still in use today. Being a keen scientist, the Reverend Clarke had obtained a copy of Darwin's Origin of Species as soon as possible after its publication. Unlike many of his fellow clergymen, both in Australia and elsewhere, Clarke was delighted by Darwin's book, even writing to Darwin in August 1861 with, among other things, extra evidence on glaciation in Australia, which Darwin included in future editions. In his letter to Darwin, Clarke also says, We have living here an old shipmate of yours, Conrad Martens, who has sometimes named you to me. He is now looking old. He was my first churchwarden here in 1846. In his reply, which was written on the 25th of October 1861, Darwin thanked Clark for his support and added, "When you next see my old shipmate, Mr. Martins, pray remember me very kindly to him. I have 2 of his sketches now hanging up in one of my rooms." In response, Martins wrote to Darwin, "Many thanks, my old shipmate, for your kind message, which I have just received by the Padre," that is, Reverend Clark. "I thought you had quite forgotten that I was in existence, and certainly the man who voluntarily sets himself down in such a place as this has no right to grumble if he finds such to be the case." And now a comment on Origin of Species. Your book of the season, as the reviewers have it, I must own I have not yet read, although Mr. Clark offered to lend it to me. I am afraid of your eloquence, and I don't want to think I have an origin in common with toads and tadpoles, for if there is anything in human nature that I hate, it is a toady. Well, that was a jolly cruise, and I hope you have been well and happy ever since. Martins died in 1878 and was buried in St Thomas Cemetery, now St Thomas Rest Park, 250 West Street, North Sydney. When the new St Thomas was dedicated in October 1884, Martin's widow donated a second set of communion vessels, which are still also in use today, as a memorial to her late husband. We now come to Augustus Earle. Unlike Martins, Earle lived for only a few years after leaving the Beagle. Furthermore, little is known of his activities during those years. He died alone in London in December 1838. When the narrative was published in 1839, engravings of 2 of Earle's sketches were included in Volume 2, which comprised Fitzroy's account of the Beagle's voyage. The first sketch, entitled Crossing the Line, shows the traditional ceremonies to which Darwin and the other first-timers were subjected during their voyage to South America. Next we come to John Clements Wickham. As second in command of the Beagle's second surveying voyage, and with Fitzroy having married and being obliged to publish the account of the Beagle's second voyage, Wickham was appointed commander for the Beagle's third surveying voyage, as we saw earlier. Here we have an undated sketch of the Beagle by Wickham. As also described in an earlier presentation, the officers of the Beagle visited Hannibal MacArthur's family at Vineyard when the ship was in Sydney Cove during that third voyage. These visits enabled Wickham to renew his acquaintance with Hannibal's daughter Annie, whom he married in 1842. By that time, Wickham had retired from the Beagle's command and from the Navy due to ill health, as we also saw earlier. Annie, you will recall, was one of the MacArthur daughters who lunched with Darwin at Vineyard in January 1836. In January 1843, Wickham was appointed police magistrate in the new settlement of Moreton Bay, which later became the city of Brisbane. 7 years later, Wickham's former shipmate Conrad Martins visited Moreton Bay and drew this distant sketch of the house called Newstead, in which Wickham and his family were living. The house still stands today as Brisbane's oldest domestic dwelling. In 1857, Wickham was appointed government resident of the Moreton Bay settlement. By September 1862, Wickham had returned to England, where he renewed contact with his former Beagle shipmates, Bartholomew Sullivan and Arthur Mellersh. All 3 visited Darwin at Down House on the 21st of October 1862. Wickham then retired to the south of France, where he died on the 6th of January 1864, aged 65. Now to Captain P.P. King. In the years following Darwin's visit, King remained active in colonial, business and political life. For several months in 1839, he was a member of the Legislative Council, but resigned to take charge as Commissioner of the powerful Australian Agricultural Company, which at that time employed 500 men, including 400 convicts, and produced 655 bales of wool and 21,200 tonnes of coal annually. As commissioner, King moved from Dunheved to a house called Tarlee on the company's extensive estates at Port Stephens, north of Newcastle. This is an 1841 Conrad Martin's view of Tarlee. After retiring from the Australian Agricultural Company, King spent his last years living in a house called Grantham, located on the northern side of Sydney Harbour, on a site now occupied by the northern approaches to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Like his fellow parishioner Conrad Martins, King was active in the affairs of St Thomas, North Sydney, becoming a church warden in 1854. Early in 1856, King learnt that he had been promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral. A few weeks later, on the 26th of February, having just returned home after dining on board a ship called HMS Juno, then anchored in the harbour, King collapsed and died. His body was ceremoniously transported across the harbour on a barge, shown here in a dramatic painting by Martins, to the accompaniment of a 22-gun salute from the Juno and another ship called HMS Herald. The cortege then proceeded via the newly constructed railway line to Parramatta and thence to the church of St Mary Magdalene, near his former home at Dunheved. Here the funeral service was conducted by King's fourth son, the Reverend R.L. King. St Mary Magdalene was very much King's own church. It was constructed between 1839 and 1840 on land donated by King from bricks made at Dunheved, and it was named after the church in Launceston, England, where King and Harriet were married. Finally, Philip Gidley King Jr. After Darwin's departure, P.G. King helped his father, P.P. King, prepare the manuscript for the first volume of the narrative. In 1842, he followed his father and joined the Australian Agricultural Company. The next year, he married another of Hannibal and Maria MacArthur's daughters, Elizabeth, and thus became Wickham's brother-in-law. By 1851, King was the superintendent of stock for the Australian Agricultural Company, and the following year he became assistant superintendent of the company's estates. Soon he had moved to Gunnaganoo, a large property on the Peel River about 200 kilometres northwest of Stroud, sketched here by King's son George. The property prospered under King's guidance, and a village with its own school and post office grew up around the homestead. While living at Gunnaganoo, King corresponded with Darwin. There are 6 extant Darwin-King letters written between 1854 and 1869. 3 are from Darwin to King, and 3 are from King to Darwin, 2 of which were written from Gunnaganoo. Each letter includes reminiscences of their shared Beagle voyage. King remained as manager of Gunnaganoo for almost 30 years before retiring to a house called Banksia in the eastern Sydney suburb of Double Bay. In 1890, King received a request from John Murray, the company that had published all of Darwin's later books, and which had also published Francis Darwin's The Life and Letters of Charles Darwin. John Murray invited King to write an article describing his experiences with Darwin on the Beagle. By November 1891, King had made no progress on the article, but he had prepared some, quote, diagram sketches of the old ship's interior arrangements, unquote, and he sent copies of these to Murray. They appeared in subsequent John Murray printings of the 1845 journal. The originals are held in the Mitchell Library in Sydney and were reproduced in the background presentation of this series. King survived for another 10 years before dying in August 1904 at the age of 86. Like his father before him, he was buried in the churchyard of St Mary Magdalene near Dunheved. Having now summarised the post-voyage stories of the major Australian-based characters in the story of Charles Darwin's visit to Australia, we move on to an Australian view of the evolutionary timescale. It was devised by Bob Beale, a science journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald for many years. In 1989, Beale made use of the convenient fact that the distance in kilometres between Perth and Sydney, namely 4,352, is roughly equivalent to the age of the Earth in millions of years. Consequently, he realised that the evolutionary timescale could be represented in terms of a train trip from Perth to Sydney. Here we have the entire timescale of the Earth, represented in terms of the distance between Perth and Sydney. Notice that backboned animals don't appear until around Broken Hill, after roughly 3/4 of the journey. The final section of Beale's evolutionary journey roughly retraces Darwin's return trip from Bathurst, starting with Taranaki, which you'll recall is one of the settlements through which Darwin rode. The platypus appears just a bit further east from where Darwin saw his platypus, and the extinction of the dinosaurs occurs very near the Emu Ferry crossing of the Nepean River. Finally, as the train approaches Central Station in Sydney, we have the invention of agriculture, roughly 20 metres from the terminus. This brings us to the end of our presentations on Charles Darwin's visit to Australia. To end on a positive note, we have an excerpt from a letter written by Darwin to his close friend and colleague J.D. Hooker in 1854. Echoing the sentiments that Darwin had expressed to Covington in 1850, in this letter Darwin tells Hooker, "I am always building veritable castles in the air about emigrating, and Tasmania has been my headquarters of late, so that I feel very proud of my adopted country." So the Australian island on which Darwin could easily have been killed by a snake in 1836 has become, almost 20 years later, the place to which he dreams of emigrating.